Princess Rosette. Once upon a time there lived a king and queen who had 2 beautiful sons and 1 little daughter who was so pretty that no one who saw her could help but loving her. When it was time for the christening of the princess, the queen, as she always did, sent for all the fairies to be present at the ceremony, and afterwards invited them to a splendid banquet. When it was over and they were preparing to go away, the queen said to them, "Do not forget your usual good custom. Tell me what is going to happen to Rosette." For that was the name of the princess, as given by the title. But the fairies said they had left their book of magic at home, and they would come another day to tell her. "Ah," said the queen, "I know very well what that means. You have nothing good to say. But at least I beg that you will not hide anything from me." So, after a good deal of persuasion, they said, "Madam, we fear that Rosette may be the cause of great misfortunes to her brothers. They may even meet their death through her. That is all we have been able to foresee about your dear little daughter. We are very sorry to have nothing better for you." Then they went away, leaving the queen very sad, so sad that the king noticed it and asked her what was the matter. The queen said that she had been sitting too near the fire and had burnt all the flax that was upon her distaff. "Oh, is that all?" said the king, and he went up to the garret and brought her down some more flax that she could spin in 100 years. But the queen still looked sad, and the king asked her again what was the matter. She answered that she had been walking by the river and had dropped one of her green satin slippers into the water. "Oh, is that all?" said the king, and he sent for all the shoemakers in the kingdom, and they very soon made the queen 10,000 green satin slippers. But she still looked very sad. So the king asked her again what was the matter, and this time she answered that in her eating the porridge too hastily, she had swallowed her wedding ring. So that it happened that the king knew better, for he had the ring himself. And he said, "Oh, you are not telling me the truth, for I have your ring here in my purse." Then the queen was very much ashamed, and she saw that the king was vexed with her. So she told him all that the fairies had predicted about Rosette, and begged him how to think of the misfortunes might be prevented. Then it was the king's turn to look sad, and at last he said, "I see no way of saving our sons except by having Rosette's head cut off while she is still little." A bit drastic. But the queen cried that she would far rather have her own head cut off, and that he had better think of something else, for she would never consent to such a thing. So they thought and thought, but they could not tell what to do, until at last the queen heard that in the great forest near the castle there was an old hermit who lived in a hollow tree, and perhaps people came from far and near to consult him. So she said, "I had better go and ask for his advice. Perhaps he will know what to do to prevent the misfortunes which the fairies foretold." She set out very early the next morning, mounted upon a pretty little white mule, which was shod in solid gold, and 2 of her ladies rode behind her on beautiful horses. When they reached the forest, they dismounted, for the trees grew so thickly that horses could not pass, and made their way on foot to the hollow tree where the hermit lived. At first, when he saw them coming, he was vexed, for he was not fond of ladies. But when he recognized the queen, he said, "You are welcome, queen. What do you come to ask me?" Then the queen told him all the fairies had foreseen for Rosette, and asked what she should do. And the hermit answered that she must shut the princess up in a tower, and never let her come out of it again. The queen thanked and rewarded him, and hastened back to the castle to tell the king. When he heard the news, he had a great tower built as quickly as possible, and there the princess was shut up, and the king and queen and her 2 brothers went to see every day that she might not be dull. The oldest brother was called the Great Prince, the second the Little Prince. They loved their sister dearly, for she was the sweetest, prettiest princess who was ever seen, and at least a little smile from her was worth more than 100 gold pieces. When Rosette was 15 years old, the Great Prince went to the king and asked if he would not soon come to time for her to be married, and the little prince put the same question towards the queen. Their majesties were amused at them for thinking of it, but did not make their reply, and soon both the king and queen were taken ill and died on the very same day. Everybody was sorry, Rosette especially, and all the bells in the kingdom were tolled. Then all the dukes and councillors put the great prince upon the golden throne, and crowned him with a diamond crown, and they all cried, "Long live the king!" And after that there was nothing but feasting and rejoicing. The new king and his brother said to one another, "Now that we are masters, let us take our sister out of that dull tower which she is so tired of." They only had to go across the garden to reach the tower, which was very high and stood up in a corner. Rosette was busy at her embroidery, but when she saw her brother she got up and, taking the king's hand, and cried, "Good morning, dear brother. Now that you are the king, please take me out of this dull tower, for I am so tired of it." Then she began to cry, but the king kissed her and told her to dry her tears. And that was just what they had come to do, to take her out of the tower and to bring her to the beautiful castle. And the prince showed her the pocketful of sugar plums that he had brought for her, and said, "Make haste, and let us get away from this ugly tower. Very soon the king will arrange grand marriage for you." When Rosette saw the beautiful garden, full of flowers and fruits, with green grass and sparkling fountains, she was so astonished that not a word could she say, for she had never in her life seen anything like it before. She looked around her and ran hither and thither, gathering fruit and flowers, and her little dog Frisk, who was bright green all over, and had but one ear, danced with her, crying, "Bow, wow, wow," and turning head over heels in the most enchanting way. Green dog. Everybody was amused at Frisk's antics, but all of a sudden he ran away into a little wood, and the princess was following him, when to her great delight she saw a peacock, who was spreading his tail in the sunshine. Rosette thought she had never seen anything so pretty. She could not take her eyes off of him, and there she stood entranced until the king and prince came up and asked what was amusing her so much. She showed them the peacock and asked what it was, and they answered that it was a bird which people sometimes ate. "What?" said the princess. "Do they dare to kill that beautiful creature and eat it? I declare that I will never marry anyone but the king of the peacocks, and when I am queen I will take good care of that nobody eats any of my subjects." Princesses. At this the king was very much astonished, as are we all. "But, little sister," he said, "where shall we find the king of peacocks?" "Oh, wherever you like, sire," she answered, "but I will never marry anyone else." After this, they took Rosette to the beautiful castle, and the peacock was brought with her, and told to walk about the terrace outside her windows, so that she might always see him. And then the ladies of the court came to see the princess, and they brought her beautiful presents. Dresses, ribbons, sweetmeats, diamonds and pearls and dolls and embroidered slippers. And she was so well brought up and said, "Thank you," so prettily and she was so gracious that everyone went away delighted with her. Meanwhile, the king and the prince were considering how they should find the king of the peacocks, if there was such a person in the world. And first of all, they had a portrait made of the princess, which was so like her that you really would not have been surprised if it had spoken to you. And then they said to her, "Since you will not marry anyone but the king of peacocks, we are going out together into the wide world to search for him. If we find him for you, we shall be very glad. In the meantime, mind you take good care of your kingdom." Rosette thanked them for all the trouble they were taking on her account, and promised to take great care of the kingdom, and only to amuse herself by looking at the peacock and making frisk dance while they were away. So they set out, and asked everyone they met, "Do you know the king of the peacocks?" But the answer was always, "No, no." Then they went on and on, so far that no one has ever been further, and at last they came to the kingdom of the cockchafers. They had never before seen a number of cockchafers, and the buzzing was so loud that the king was afraid he should be deafened by it. He asked the most distinguished-looking cockchafer if he had ever met or if he knew where they could find the king of peacocks. "Sire," replied the cockchafer, "his kingdom is 30,000 leagues from this. You have come the longest way." "Oh, and how do you know that?" said the king. "Oh," said the cockchafer, "we know all you very well, since we spent 2 or 3 months in your garden every year." Thereupon the king and the prince made great friends with him, and they all walked arm in arm and dined together, and afterwards the cockchafer showed them all the curiosities of his strange country, where the tiniest green leaf costs a gold piece, and more. Then they set out again to finish their journey, and this time, as they knew the way, they were not long upon the road. It was easy to guess that they had come to the right place, for they saw peacocks in every tree, and their cries could be heard a long way off. Let's see if I can do a good peacock impersonation. Yep, that sounds like a peacock. Sorry. Then they reached the city, and they found it full of men and women who were dressed entirely in peacock feathers, which were evidently, though, prettier than anything else. They soon met the king, who was driving about in a beautiful little golden carriage which glittered with diamonds, and was drawn at full speed by 12 peacocks. The king and the prince were delighted to see that the king of the peacocks was as handsome as possible. He had curly golden hair and was very pale, and he wore a crown of peacock's feathers. When he saw Rosette's brothers, he knew them at once, and that they were strangers, and stopping his carriage, he sent for them to speak to him. When they had greeted him, they said, "Sire, we have come from very far away to show you a beautiful portrait." So saying, they drew from their traveling bag the picture of Rosette. The king looked at it in silence for a long time, but at last he said, "I could not have believed that there was such a beautiful princess in the world." "Indeed, she really is 100 times as pretty as that," said her brothers. "I think you must be making fun of me," replied the King of Peacocks. "Sire," said the prince, "my brother is a king like yourself. He is called the king. I am called the prince. And that is a portrait of our sister, the princess Rosette. We have come to ask if you would like to marry her. She is as good as she is beautiful, and we will give her a bushel of gold pieces for her dowry."
"Oh, with all my heart," replied the king, "and I will make her very happy. She shall have whatever she likes, and I shall love her dearly. Only, I warn you that if she is not as pretty as you have told me, I will have your heads cut off."
"Oh, certainly we can quite agree to that," said one of the brothers in one breath.
"Very well. Off with you into prison, and stay there until the princess arrives," said the King of the Peacocks.
And the princess were so sure that Rosette was far prettier than her portrait that they winced without a murmur. They were very kindly treated, and that they might not feel dull while the king came often to see them. As for Rosette's portrait, it was taken up to the palace, and the king did nothing but gaze at it all day and all night. As the king and the prince had to stay in prison, they sent a letter to the princess telling her to pack up all her treasures as quickly as possible and come to them, as the King of Peacocks was waiting to marry her. But they did not say that they were in prison for fear of, making her queasy. When Rosette received the letter, she was so delighted that she ran about telling everyone that the King of Peacocks was found, and she was going to marry him. Guns were fired, fireworks were set off. Everyone had as many cakes and sweetmeats as they wanted. And for 3 days, everybody who came to see the princess was presented with a slice of bread and jam, a nightingale's egg, and some hippocras. After having thus entertained her friends, she distributed her dolls among them, and left her brother's kingdom to the care of the wisest old men in the city, telling them to take charge of everything, not to spend any money, and save it all up until the king should return, and above all, not to forget to feed her peacock. Then she set out, only taking with her her nurse and her nurse's daughter, and the little green dog Frisk. They took a boat and put out to sea, carrying with them the bushel of gold pieces, and enough dresses to last the princess 10 years if she wore 2 of them every day. And a wardrobe. And they did nothing but laugh and sing. The nurse asked the boatman, Can you take us to the kingdom of the peacocks?" But he answered, "Oh no, oh no." And then she said, you must take us. And he answered, very soon, very soon. And then the nurse said, Will you take us? And the boatman answered, Yes, yes. And then she whispered in his ear, Do you want to make your fortune? And he said, Certainly I do. Can I tell you how to get a bag of gold? Said she. I ask nothing better, said the boatsman. Well, said the nurse, tonight, when the princess is asleep, you must help me throw her into the sea. And when she is drowned, I will put her beautiful clothes upon my daughter, and we will take her to the King of the Peacocks, who will only be too glad to marry her. And as a reward, you shall have a boat full of diamonds. That would sink it. The boatman was very much surprised at the proposal and said, But what a pity to drown such a pretty princess. The boatman, however, was persuaded by the nurse to help him. And when the night came and the princess was fast asleep as usual, with Frisk curled up on his cushion on the foot of her bed, the wicked nurse fetched the boatman and her daughter, and between them they picked up the princess, feather bed, mattress, pillows, blankets and all, and threw her into the sea without even waking her. Now, luckily the princess's bed was entirely stuffed with phoenix feathers, which are very rare and have the property of always floating upon water, so Rosette went on swimming about as if she had been on a boat. After a little while she began to feel very cold, and turned round so often that she woke Frisk, who started up, and, having a very good nose, smelt the soles and herrings so close to him that he began to bark. He barked so long and so loud that he woke all the other fish, who came swimming up to the princess's bed, and poking at it with their great heads. As for her, she said to herself, "How does our boat rock upon the water? I'm really glad that I am not often as comfortable as I have been tonight." She was, however, a deep sleeper. The wicked nurse and the boatman, who were by this time a long way off, heard Frisk barking, and said to each other, "That horrid little animal and his mistress are drinking our health in our seawater by now. Let us make haste to land, for we must be quite near the city of the King of Peacocks." The king had sent 100 carriages to meet them, drawn by every kind of strange animal. There were lions, tigers, bears, oh my, wolves, stags, horses, buffaloes, eagles, and of course peacocks. The carriage intended for Princess Rosette had 6 blue monkeys, which could turn somersaults and dance on a tightrope, and do many other charming tricks. Their harness was of crimson velvet with red buckles, and behind the carriage walked 60 beautiful ladies chosen by the king to wait upon Rosette to amuse her. The nurse was quite taken by all the pains imaginable to deck out her daughter as princess. She put her on Rosette's prettiest frock and covered her with diamonds from head to foot. But, well, she was so ugly that nothing could make her look nice. And what was worse, she was sulky and ill-tempered, and did nothing but grumble the whole time. Teenager. Once she stepped from the boat, and the escort sent by the king of the peacocks caught sight of her. They were so surprised that they could not say a single word. "Now then, look alive!" cried the false princess. "If you don't bring me something to eat, I shall have all your heads cut off." Then they whispered, one to another, "Here's a pretty state of things. She's as wicked as she is ugly. What a bride for a poor king. She certainly was not worth bringing from the other world." But she went on ordering them about, and for no fault at all would give slaps and pinches to everyone she could reach. As the procession was so long, it advanced but slowly, and the nurse's daughter sat up in her carriage trying to look like a queen. But the peacocks who were sitting upon every tree walking and waiting to salute her, who made up their minds to cry, "Long live our beautiful queen." But when they caught sight of the false bride, they could not help crying instead, "Oh, how ugly she is!" Which offended her so much that she said to the guards, "Make haste and kill those insolent peacocks who dared to insult me." But the peacocks only flew away, laughing at her. The rogue of a boatman, who noticed all this, said softly to the nurse, "This is bad business for us, gossip. Your daughter ought to have been prettier." But she answered, "Be quiet, stupid, or you'll spoil everything."
And now they told the king that the princess was approaching. "Well," he said, "did her brothers tell me truly? Is she prettier than her portrait?"
"Sire," they answered, "if she were as pretty as that, you would do very well."
"That's true," said the king. "I, for one, shall be quite satisfied if she is. Let us go and meet her." For they knew by the uproar that she had arrived. But they could not tell what all the shouting was about. The king thought he could hear the words, "Oh, ugly is she! How ugly she is!" But he fancied they must refer to some dwarf the princess was bringing with her. It never occurred to him that they could apply that to his bride themselves. The Princess Rosette's portrait was carried at the head of the procession, and after it walked the king, surrounded by his courtiers. He was all impatience to see the lovely princess, but when he caught sight of the nurse's daughter, he was furiously angry, and would not advance another step, for she was really ugly enough to have frightened anybody. "What?" he cried. "Have those two rascals who are my prisoners dared to play such a trick on me as this? Do they propose that I shall marry this hideous creature? Let her be shut up in my great tower, with her nurse and those who brought her here. And as for them, I will have their heads cut off." And let lunch. Meanwhile, the king and the prince, who knew that their sister must have arrived, had made themselves smart, and sat expecting every minute to be summoned to greet her. So when the jailer came with soldiers and carried them down to the black dungeon, which swarmed with toads and bats, and where they were up to their necks in water, nobody could have been more surprised or dismayed than they were. "Oh, this is a dismal kind of wedding," they said. "What could have happened that we should be treated like this? They mean to kill us." And this annoyed them very much. Imagine. 3 days passed before they heard any news, and then the King of Peacocks came and berated them through a hole in the wall. "You have called yourselves king and prince," he cried, "to try to make me marry your sister, but you are nothing but beggars, not worth the water you drink. I mean to make short work of you, with a sword being sharpened that will cut off your heads." "King of Peacocks," answered the king angrily, "you had better take care what you're about. I'm as good a king as yourself, and I have a splendid kingdom and robes and crowns and plenty of good red gold to do what I like with. You are pleased to jest about cutting our heads off? Perhaps you think we have stolen something from you." At first the King of Peacocks was taken aback by this bold speech, and had half a mind to send them away altogether. But his Prime Minister declared that it would never do to let such a trick that is pass unpunished. Everybody would laugh at him, so the accusation was drawn up against him that they were impostors, and that they had promised the king a beautiful princess in marriage who, when she arrived, proved to be an ugly peasant girl. This accusation was read to the prisoners, who cried out that they had spoken the truth, that their sister was indeed a princess more beautiful than they, and that there was some mystery about all of this which they could not in faith fathom. Therefore they demanded 7 days in which to prove their innocence. The King of Peacocks was so angry that they would hardly even grant them his favor, but at last he was persuaded to do so. While all this was going on at court, let us see what had happened to the real princess. When the day broke, she and Frisk were equally astonished at finding themselves alone upon the sea, with no boat, and no one to help them. The princess cried and cried until even the fishes were sorry for her. "Alas," she said, The king of peacocks must have ordered me to be thrown into the sea because he had changed his mind and did not want to marry me. But how strange of him, when I should have loved him so much. We should have been so very happy together.
And then she cried harder than ever, for she could not help but still loving him. So for 2 days they floated up and down the sea, wet and shivering with cold, and so hungry that when the princess saw some oysters, she caught them. And she and Frisk both ate some, though they didn't like them at all. Can't blame her. When night came, the princess was so frightened that she said to Frisk,
"Oh, please do keep on barking, for fear the soul should come and eat us up."
Now, it happened that they floated close to the shore, where a poor old man was living alone in his little cottage. But when he heard Frisk barking, he thought to himself, "There must have been a shipwreck, for no dogs, passed by that way on chance." And he went out to see if he could be of any use. He soon saw the princess and Frisk floating up and down, and Rosette, stretching out her hands to him, cried,
"Oh, good old man, do save me, or I shall die of cold and hunger."
When he heard this cry, and it was so piteous, he was very sorry for her, and ran back to his house to fetch a long boat hook. Then he waded into the water up to his chin, and after being nearly drowned once or twice, he at last successfully grabbed a hold of the princess's bed, then dragged it to shore. Rosette and Frisk were joyful enough to find themselves once more on dry land, and the princess thanked the old man heartily. Then, wrapping herself up in her blankets, she daintily picked her way up to the cottage on her little bare feet. There the old man lighted a fire of straw, and then drew an old box of his wife's dress and shoes, which the princess put on. And thus, roughly clad, she looked as charming as possible, and Frisk danced his very best to amuse her. The old man saw that Rosette must be some great lady, for her bed coverings were satin and gold. He begged that she would tell him all her history, that she might safely trust him. The princess told him everything, weeping bitterly again at the thought that it was the king's orders that she should be thrown overboard. "And now, my daughter, what is to be done?" said the old man. "You are a great princess, accustomed to fare daintily, and I have nothing to offer but black bread and radishes, which will not suit you at all. Shall I go and tell the king of peacocks that you are here? If he sees you, he will certainly wish to marry you."
"Oh, no," cried Rosette. "He must be wicked since he tried to drown me. Don't let us tell him, but if you have a little basket to give it to me."
He gave her a basket, and tying it around Frisk's neck, she said to him,
"Go and find out the best cooking pot in town and bring the contents to me."
Away went Frisk, and there was no better dining in town than the king's. He adroitly took the cover off the pot, and brought all that it contained to the princess, who said,
"Now go back to the pantry and bring the best of everything you find there."
So Frisk went back and filled his basket with white bread, red wine, and every kind of sweetmeat, until it was almost too heavy for that little dog to carry. When the king of peacocks wanted his dinner, there was nothing in the pot, and nothing in the pantry. All the courtiers looked at one another in dismay, and the king was terribly cross. "Oh, well," he said, "if there is no dinner I cannot dine, and take care of the plenty of things are roasted for supper." When evening came, the princess said to Frisk,
"Go into town and find out the best kitchen, and bring me all the nicest morsels that are being roasted upon the spit."
Frisk did as he was told, and he knew no better kitchen than the king's. He went in softly, and when the cook's back was turned, took everything that was upon the spit. As it happened, it was all done to a turn, and looked so good that it had made him hungry only to see it. He carried his basket to the princess, who at once sent him back to the pantry to bring all the tarts and sugar plums that had been prepared for the king's supper. The king, as he had had no dinner, was very hungry, and wanted his supper early. But when he asked for it, lo and behold, it was gone, and he had to go to bed half-starved, and in a terrible temper. The next day the same thing happened, and the next, so that for 3 days the king got nothing at all to eat, because just when the dinner or supper was ready to be served, it mysteriously disappeared. At last, the Prime Minister began to be afraid that the king would be starved to death, so he resolved to hide himself in some dark corner of the kitchen, and never take his eyes off the cooking pot. His surprise was great when he persistently saw a little green dog with one ear slip softly through the kitchen, uncover the pot, transfer all of its contents to his basket, and then run away again. The Prime Minister followed hastily and tracked him all through the town to the cottage of the good old man. Then he ran back to the king and told him that he had found out where all his dinners and suppers went. The king, who was very much astonished, said he should like to go and see for himself. So he set out, accompanied by the Prime Minister and a guard of the archers, and arrived just in time to find the old man and the princess finishing his dinner. The king ordered that they should be seized and bound with ropes, and Frisk also. When they were brought back to the palace, someone told the king, who said, "Today is the last day of the grand respite of those impostors. They shall have their heads cut off at the time of these stealers of my dinner." Then the old man went down to his knees before the king and begged for time to tell him everything. When he spoke, the king, for the first time, looked attentively at the princess, because he was so sorry to see how she cried, and when he heard the old man saying that her name was Rosette, and that she had been treacherously thrown into the sea, he turned head over heels 3 times without stopping. Acrobatic. In spite of being quite weak from hunger, and ran to embrace her and untied the ropes which bound her with his own hands, declaring that he loved her with all his heart. Messengers were sent to bring the princes out of the prison, and they came very sadly, believing that they were to be executed at once. The nurse and her daughter and the boatmen were brought also. As soon as they came in, Rosette ran to embrace her brothers, while the traitors threw themselves down before her and begged for mercy. The king and the princess were so happy that they freely forgave them, and as for the good old man, he was splendidly rewarded, and spent the rest of his days in the palace. The king of peacocks made ample amends to the king and prince in the way he had treated them, and did everything in his power to show that he was really very sorry for that. The nurse restored to Rosette all her dresses and jewels and the bushel of gold pieces, and the wedding was held at once, and they all lived happily ever after, even to Frisk, who enjoyed the greatest luxury, and never had anything worse than a wing of a partridge for dinner the rest of his life.